Jaya Radha Kunja Bihare Jaya Radha Kunja Bihare Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhare Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhare Yasodanandana Prajajanaranja Jasodanandana Prajajanaranja Jasodananda Brajajanaranja Jasodananda Brajajanaranja Janmona Jira Vanachari Janmona Jira Vanachari Janmona Jira Vanachari Janmona Jira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihare Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya
Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
So we're reading from the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, text 3. The chapter is called Transcendental Knowledge. We'll begin with the shloka. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Aksaram Brahma Param Sabhavo Jatman Muchyate Bhuta Bhavo Bhavakaro Visagara Kara Samgyutaha Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Aksaram Brahma Paramam Swabhavo Vyatyamam Uchyate Bhutta Bhavo Bhavakaro Visagra Karma Samadnitaha. Does anyone want to repeat? Okay, I guess we'll keep going. We'll read the synonyms. Sri Bhagavan Uvacha, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, Aksaram, indestructible, Brahma, Brahman, Paramam, transcendental, Swabhavaha, eternal nature, Adiyatmam, the self, Ujate is called, Bhutabhava Udbhava Karaha, producing the material bodies of the living entities, Visargaha, creation, Karma, fruit of activities, Samgyanitaha is called, translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Srila Prabhupada. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, the indestructible, transcendental living entity is called Brahman, and his eternal nature is called Adiyatma, the self. Action pertaining to the development of the material bodies of the living entities is called karma, or fruit of activities. Purport. Brahman is indestructible and eternally existing, and its constitution is not changed at any time. But beyond Brahman, there is the Parabrahman. Brahman refers to the living entity, and Parabrahman refers to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The constitutional position of the living entity is different from the position he takes in the material world. In the material world, the material consciousness, his nature is to try to be the Lord of matter. But in spiritual consciousness, Krishna consciousness, his position is to serve the Supreme. When a living entity is in the material consciousness, he has to take on various bodies in the material world. That is called karma, or very creation by the force of material consciousness. In the Vedic literature, the living entity is called Jivatma, or Jivatma, and Brahman, but he is never called Parabrahman. The living entity, Jivatma, takes different positions. Sometimes he merges into the dark material nature and identifies himself with matter. And sometimes he identifies himself with the superior spiritual nature. Therefore, he is called the Supreme Lord's marginal energy. According to his identification with the material or spiritual nature, he receives a material or spiritual body. In the material nature, he may take a body from any of the 8,400,000 species of life. But in the spiritual nature, he has only one body. In the material nature, he is unmanifested, sometimes as a man, demigod, animal, beast, bird, etc. According to this karma, to attain material heavenly planets and enjoy their facilities, he sometimes performs sacrifices, yajna. But when his merit is exhausted, he returns to the earth again in the form of man. This process is called karma. In the Chandogya Upanishad, it describes the Vedic sacrificial processes. On the sacrificial altar, 5 kinds of offerings are made into 5 kinds of fire. The 5 kinds of fire are conceived of as heavenly planets, clouds, the earth, man, and woman. And their 5 kinds of sacrificial offerings are faith, the enjoyer, on the moon, rain, grains, and semen. In the process of sacrifice, the living entity makes specific sacrifices to attain specific heavenly planets, and consequently reaches them. When the merit of sacrifice is exhausted, the living entity descends to the earth in the form of rain. Then he takes on the form of grains, and the grains are eaten by man and transformed into semen, which impregnates a woman. And thus the living entity once again attains the human form to perform sacrifices and so repeat the same cycle. In this way, the living entity perpetually comes and goes on the material path. The Krishna conscious person, however, avoids such sacrifices. He takes directly to Krishna consciousness and thereby prepares himself to return to Godhead. And personalist commentators on the Bhagavad Gita unreasonably assume that Brahma takes the form of Jiva and the material world. And to substantiate this, they refer to chapter 15, verse 7 of the Gita. But in this verse, the Lord also speaks of the living entity as the eternal fragment of myself. The fragment of God, the living entity, may fall down into the material world, but the Supreme Lord, Achyuta, never falls down. Therefore, this assumption that the Supreme Brahman assumes the form of Jiva is not accepted or acceptable. It is important to remember that the Vedic literature's Brahman, the living entity, is distinguished from the Param Brahma, the Supreme Lord. Om Gyanam Dharmanasya Gana Jana Shalakya Chakchuru Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah Shri Chaitanya Manopishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadatikam Bandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Patakabalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrachatam Sahagana Raganathavitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahita Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padasahagana Lidita Shivi Sakkavitamscha E Krishna Karunu Sindo Jino Banjo Jagatpite Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishparanustuti Devi Parinami Hari Priye Vanjakapa Guru Prishcha Kripa Sindhu Bevacha Patitinam Bhada Beva Vaishnavi Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasudeva Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So going back to this particular shloka, there's interesting points that I thought were very poignant for our lesson today. And one is understanding Adhyatmam. We also understand that word, we also reference it in conjunction with the threefold miseries, right? We have Adibhuta, Adhyatma, Adhyatmika, Adhyabhautika. And so these Adhyatmika, we have this word referring to the self. So that's miseries that are actually perpetuated on by the self and the body, because oftentimes the body is also referred to as the self. But in this particular case, we understand it as the soul. So there are many references that we actually come across with this Adhyatmikam. And we've heard this reference in the Bhagavad Gita 7:29. Krishna makes mention of this again. Jara maranam mokshaya mam ashritya yantateye te brahmate vidu krishnam adhyatmam karma chahilam. So the translation there, an intelligent person who are endeavoring for liberation from old age and death take refuge in me in devotional service. They are actually Brahman. So this word Adhyatmam is Brahman. This is what Brahman is. And so we see many other references to the statement of what Brahman is, or getting back to the self. We also covered this in the first sloka of this chapter. Arjuna uvacha kim tat brahma kim adiyatmam. So we see that word there again. And so the way in 8.1, the way it is defined, is defined again as self. And so Arjuna is asking when he says Arjuna uvacha, he's saying, Arjuna said, but kim tat brahman kim adiyatmam, right? So what is Brahman? This is what he's asking. And what is the self? So he's asking actually, Krishna, can you help distinguish what Brahman is and what is the self, right? And so there's a lot of detail that goes into trying to define. So it's really important. We also understand this in Srimad Bhagavatam 428:65. We come across that in the first. Someone can mute their mic. I hear a lot of background noise. So in the very first pada of that shloka, we hear Badhishmam itad adiyatmam. Okay, so we have that mentioned there. And this adiyatmam is the narration of self-realization. So the way they do this, this person, right? The person is the self. We're dealing with a noun here. And so the question is, my dear king, Padichinna Bari, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the cause of all causes, is celebrated to be known indirectly. Thus I have described the story of the Paranjana to you. Actually, it is an instruction for the self. And so I believe in this, they actually get a little bit into the idea of the cause of all causes. So if we really consider this, Krishna is the Param Brahma, and we are the Brahman. So it begs to ask the question, then why are we so anxious to come to the Brahman realization? Because we have these three stages. So when we're really talking about that Brahman, we're talking about the Supreme Param Brahman, right? But also as we look further into this shloka, if we go back to, well, actually, let me just start from 3:11:42 of the Srimad Bhagavatam. We also have that word again, aksharam. So it's tat ahur aksharam brahma, sarva karanam karanam, Vishnu dhamma param satsat, purushasya mahatmanaha. So the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, is therefore said to be the original cause of all causes. Thus, the spiritual abode of Vishnu is eternal without a doubt. And it's also the abode of Mahavishnu, the original or the origin of all manifestations. And then in that particular, when we have that Sarva Karana Karanam, where do we get that from? Well, that's in the Brahma Samhita, this very first sloka. Ishwaraha Paramaha Krishna, Satchidananda Vigraha, Adadi Adi Govindam, Sarva Karana Karanam, the cause of all causes. So this cause of all causes, we become this spark of this splendor of Krishna. We're spiritual sparks. So as a spiritual spark, we can actually get into understanding how we work with identity, real identity, as opposed to ahankara vimudatma, one who is bewildered by false identity. So in this reality or identity that we are trying to assume, we have to first understand the constitution of what it means to be indestructible. So Krishna mentions this in the Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavad Gita, 2nd chapter, 23rd verse, where he says, Nainam chandiri shastrani, nainam dehi tipavaka, nainam kladante apo, nasusaitu mavata. So he's saying that the soul cannot be cut by any weapon. The soul cannot be burned by fire. The soul cannot be moistened by water, nor can it be dried by the wind. And then later in that particular, I think it's the very next verse, Bhagavad Gita text 24, he goes on to say the individual soul is unbreakable, it's insoluble, and it can neither be burned nor dried. He is everlasting, present everywhere, unchangeable, immovable, eternally the same. And then in 25, it says, he said that the soul is invisible, inconceivable, immutable.
It's 1 o'clock.
Knowing this, you should not grieve for the body. This is what he's telling Arjuna. So we're getting a clear and definite idea what the Brahman is, what is Ariyakam. So this is the constitution of the soul. So one may ask, then what about all the other material effects? Well, those material effects, gross matter, subtle matter, they are not in the margin. We're in the margin, we're marginal. In other words, we can gravitate toward the inferior energy, or we can gravitate toward the superior energy. So some conversations come up, then what about matter? Isn't matter also the Lord's energy? Yes, it is. It's coming from him. So if it's coming from Krishna, then it also must possess some consciousness. Well, as we can see from the spiritual world, everything is conscious. The grass, the trees, the rocks, the water, everything. So why isn't that the case in the material setting? Well, one, it's a gross reflection. And everything in that gross reflection is dull, even the marginal energy, such as us. So once we start to cultivate and purify our consciousness, then we can see a temple becomes a living thing. Articles, paraphernalia of Krishna, conch shell, the whisk, the fan, all these items, they become spiritualized. So with the spiritualization, there's consciousness there. So we have to be very, very astute to understanding how to see Krishna in all things. So this is very suitable. So Prabhupada is saying in the purport, as we transition, that in the material nature, the soul, or the Adhyatmakam, may take a body from any of the 4,400,000 species. He doesn't mention the other material objects because they're just dull. They're just dull matter. But we can deduce that in order for that energy to bind, there has to be the presence of some consciousness there, that consciousness being Krishna, and also the molecules, the atoms that bind those things together. They're all under the direction of Krishna, not directly, but these are Krishna's energies. And then his supervising energies carry out the function. So we can say like Mother Earth. Mother Earth gets a hiccup, we get a volcano, we get magma, rock, all these kind of things. So that can only happen only if there is a living presence. So consciousness needs to be there in order for that to take place. So when we're really thinking about this, we should see the presence of conscious beings and animated forms, and then we have unconscious beings in inanimate forms. So everything belonging to Krishna, when it's transferred into the spiritual realm, everything is completely conscious. So those are some points. The other points about how we engage in so much karma. So we do all these karmic activities, karma. We engage in the 5 types of sacrifices, right? And why do we do that? We're still trying to lord over nature. And so we're trying to make our situation comfortable. We're trying to make our spiritual situation, or not our spiritual, but our material situation comfortable. So in that comfort, we will engage in some severe sacrifices in order to accommodate our material needs. A general example would be someone who's very particular about their sense gratification. So they engage in drugs. So their sacrifices, I will work, or I will steal, or I will borrow, just so that I can get that high. And if I can attain that high, then I'll try to reproduce it again. But we see that the material body is chuta. It's fallible. It's not infallible, like Krishna. But when we are operating on a spiritual platform, then we become like achuta. We become literally aja, unborn. We start to connect with our real factual identity. But our problem right now is just illusion. We are still trying to lord. When we go through situations where we don't get along with others, we're trying to lord. When we try to exploit others, we're trying to lord. And we should be thinking about that, even with devotees. How can I exploit other devotees? Sometimes we don't think we do that, but we do. So we fall into these 8,400,000 species. So if we're not careful, even as devotees, what we're doing, we could easily come back in the form of rain, then grain, then man eats, production of semen. We get born again. Maybe we're lucky to be born in a devotee family. We could be, but we may have some severe hardships because we still have lessons to learn. So it's very important how we treat others. I was actually having this conversation with my better half about treating people the way you would like to be treated. And some people take that wrong. They think, well, I treated this person so nice, then they should treat me this way. That's not how that works. You just simply treat people the way you want to be treated. Because we're being watched. We're always being observed, right? Our guru is observing. The gurus are observing us. The parampara is observing us. So they're trying to track how we're trying to identify in terms of the body and how many machinations of material bodies we may want to take. So hopefully all of us are committed to this being our last life. And if it's not, then we should be committed to some principles of treating people better so that we could at least have better facility to practice Krishna consciousness. And we should want that now. That's not something that you have to wait until your next life to do. In this life, if we treat others better as ourselves, because Krishna also uses that terminology that the Adhyatma is, they're like myself. Those souls are like myself. Like means qualitatively the same, yet quantitatively different. So we're very much like Krishna. We're just very small. But even with that small, minute quantity of Krishna that we are, we can still be successful because we're always in position to get help. That's called humility. When you're humble, you can hear things, you can have questions answered, whether they're in lectures or if you're watching or whatever the situation may be. We're always in a position to receive help because Krishna, he's incessant about helping us progress toward him. There's a saying that for every step we take toward Krishna, Krishna takes 10 steps toward us. Krishna is actually more anxious for us to be out of this material setting. I like to also call it the cloud of consciousness, because this is all just, we manifest this consciousness, and then these things manifest. This is how we become creators. We become the cause of our own mess. And as Mother Isho quoted Srila Prabhupada, the only thing that we produce is stool. And so this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. We're manifesting things that we're reluctant to flush. And so by Krishna consciousness, this process of chanting the Maha Mantra, we actually cleanse ourselves. It is the prophylactic. It is the sterilizing agent that cleanses the consciousness so that we can move to a higher place of consciousness. Other points that are made is how the impersonalist commentators make all types of unreasonable assumptions about what Brahman is. And they often say, well, Krishna is Brahman. So they try to reduce, and this is what we do. When we come in contact with great personalities, the tendency that we do is we try to compare ourselves. It's kind of like Dr. Frog in the well. You know, one frog says, hey, there's this great big ocean beyond this well. And the frog is trying to compare by, he blows himself up like that big, you know, no, bigger. And he tries to get, well, like this big? And he says, no, bigger, until he explodes himself. You know, we can't compare, right, with Krishna, great souls, because those, even the great souls, are connected to Krishna. So by dint of that connection, there's expansion. So what we try to do, we compare ourselves. Well, how great is this person compared to my greatness, right? And actually, we have no greatness unless that greatness is Krishna. So when someone sees you and they compliment you, you can thank them on behalf of Krishna. Well, thank you. Krishna thanks you for acknowledging, you know, this greatness, because he put it there, because we are part and parcel of that. We are his marginal expansions. We're not sin for sin expansion. We're marginal. That margin means we have the quality of Krishna and not the quantity of Krishna. So Achyuta never falls down. Therefore, this assumption that the Supreme Brahman assumes the form of a jiva, Prabhupada said this is not acceptable, right? So he said it's important to remember that in the Vedic literature, the living entity is distinguished from the Paramatma, the super soul, simply because we are covered by Krishna's illusionary energies and Krishna's not. That's the distinction. And when Krishna manifests himself, he's always the same. He's the self-same personality all the time. We assume different identities because we've worked so hard to forget our original identity. Now we have to put work in to remember what our original identity is. So I will stop there, leave some time for some questions, comments, corrections. We'll open up the floor for the devotees to add their realizations to this particular shloka. Hare Krishna.